Hello, another week. Right, let's kick off in America with what Americans spend their money upon. It's an interesting presentation. It's all averaged out, so it won't describe you exactly, but it's meant to be the US average consumer unit. Age 49.4, number of vehicles owned 2, percentage of homeowners 66%, number of persons in consumer unit 2.5, parents and one kid, number of earners 1.3, income before taxes around $63,000, after taxes $49,000. So that's paying about a quarter, 25% in taxes of the income before taxes. So where should we start on this circly thing? On the right, orange, housing. That seems to be an awful big percentage figure. Over a third of money goes on housing. It seems a lot, but there it is. Let's go down and round. So we'll go to the bottom, and the little red bit is apparel, clothing and services. A very small amount, really. Only 3.5% goes towards apparel. Swinging round to the red-blue, we've got transportation, which is quite a big whack at over 15%. But I suppose that involves buying the car, or renting the car, as you lot do, really, the way you buy cars. Healthcare seems reasonable at 6.4%. Entertainment at 5%. Again, that seems reasonable if you're going to spend 5% of your average annual expenditure on entertainment. That sounds reasonable. Insurance and pensions. Insurance is a modern, definite thing. It's not much over 10% at 11 point something percent. Everything else, well, there's always going to be an everything else box. And food at 13%, which is going up, and we'll come to that later. That's quite high compared to some other figures I know for American households at 13%. But that includes eating out and eating in. So, what do you think of that? Anyway, let's move on to two other ways of looking at this sort of aspect of things. This one is energy costs take a bigger bite out of Americans' wallets. This is from Grigor, and we can see it goes back to 2002 when it was 7.69% for energy, and now it is over 12%. So that's a 5% increase in energy that has to be paid for by Americans, and that's 5% that's got to come out from some other place on the circle to go into energy. Energy in this case including heating, power and gasoline, green, red and blue respectively. And here's another one from Street Talk Live, which is Doug Short by any other name, but certainly by the look of this chart. Food and energy as a percentage, or divided by somewhere along the line, wage and salary disbursements, being exact with the title, and I'm sure Doug Short has been exact with the figures, but all we need is the take. It's going back to 2000, and the line is bottom left, top right. More money is being spent on food and energy as a percentage of disposable income. Right, that ends the first part of this presentation, and we're going to go on to bigger subjects now. An autopsy on the US financial system, accident, suicide or negligent homicide, by Ross Levine at Brown University. Now, I've watched a couple of lectures from Brown University lately, and it's a pretty smart place. Rhode Island, so it won't be smart long because they're running severely out of money there. But let's go to findings. That's where this one really hits. The evidence is inconsistent with the view that the collapse of the financial system was caused only by the popping of the housing bubble. an accident, and herding behaviour of financiers rushing to create and market increasingly complex and questionable financial products, suicide. Rather, the evidence indicates that senior policymakers repeatedly designed, implemented and maintained policies that destabilized the global financial system in the decade, I think that could be decades, before the crisis. Moreover, although the major regulatory agencies were aware of the growing fragility of the financial system due to their policies, they chose not to modify those policies, suggesting that negligent homicide contributed to the financial system's collapse. Basically, what we have here in this paper is, excuse me, the finger pointing pretty much at government. Government doing things that caused things to happen. And then the regulatory agencies, knowing that the government did this and caused this, didn't want to come in and call bullshit on it. Because if they called bullshit on it down here, down there would immediately point back to their superiors in government and say, well, why do you think we're doing this? Should I do a little spiel now? I'll do a little spiel now because I haven't done this for 3 years, I don't think, because I remember I did it on YouTube and got howled down. The always historical problem with banking and government is that banking is intrinsically unstable, dangerous thing, because it's using short-term funding to fund long-term projects. And the only way that can work, this is what Mervyn King, the Bank of England man, was saying. It's intrinsically a dangerous system. So the government has to be there on the side to guarantee that if there's a run on the bank, they will back the fact that the banks have done the right thing, funding those long-term projects. Because the money is not immediately available there to pay everyone back. It never is. So knowing this, the government regulates the banking system more than any other system out there. So the banking system knows that the government is obliged to bail it out. That's true, but the government knows that it's obliged to bail it out. And why is it obliged to bail it out? Because if it goes wrong, the bankers say, well, you told us what to do. We wanted to do this, you told us to do that, we did that, we've blown up. It's your fault. And it is their fault. It's just a fact. It's the government's fault. Because they tell the bankers what to do. Okay, that was a bit of a stronger version on one side of that than I was probably intending to do, but there we go. Let's go. New data on bankers' risk aversion. New book out. Probably the most controversial claim of the book will prove to be our suggestion that the behaviour of bankers before the crisis was actually risk averse, at least in the aggregate. The risk aversion claim rests on two facts: the much higher than legally required capital ratios of commercial banks and savings and loans before the crisis, and the fact that commercial banks and S&Ls overwhelmingly bought the least lucrative and supposedly safest mortgage-backed securities, those implicitly guaranteed by the federal government through Fannie and Freddie congressional charters, and those rated AAA. Okay, the banks were buying the safe stuff. Look at the article, see what the major banks had. More even than the governments were telling them to have, as in capital backing. Right. I didn't think we'd go here, but that's fine. Let's go to this. Cullen Roche talking about John Mauldin's latest letter. The following is an excerpt from John Mauldin's weekly letter. He touches on the controversial CDS event in Europe and how the Greek haircut isn't technically a default that triggers CDS. Now, if saying that you're not going to pay 50% of the contract is not a default, what is? Okay. He makes some of the most succinct and excellent comments on the subject I have yet seen. Like Mr. Mauldin, I believe there are unintended consequences to changing the rules and essentially manipulating the markets, as has clearly been done here. In this case, the biggest risk might just be a buyer's revolt in Italian bonds, as buyers realise that they can't effectively hedge high-risk bet via the CDS market. Why buy CDS now if the authorities have put the strangle on the people that say what triggers and what doesn't trigger to say nothing triggers? So why buy a CDS? So you can't hedge your risk, as everybody wants to do, to balance out if it goes wrong, well, at least I get this back. If you haven't got that, then you have to add that extra risk premium on to your purchase price. In other words, you'll pay less for it, more interest. Could this actually exacerbate the euro crisis and lead to higher Italian bond yields and a more difficult fiscal outlook? I certainly think so. And I don't know if you sign up to Maudlin. I don't like the person, but he does have some good ideas. Right, let's have a stab at this. A very good article in Project Syndicate. The good news for Europe is that it will not reenact the dramatic collapse of Lehman Brothers. The European Central Bank's unlimited ability to provide liquidity ensures that, but European leaders have yet to recognise that old bank business models are obsolete, and that reliance on private sector leverage for balance sheet repair of both sovereign and bank is doomed to failure. And we've got to have in our heads now that the sovereigns and banks are intrinsically linked together. One falls, the other falls. Now they're just like drunks leaning against each other. Now, the sovereigns normally have more credibility than the banks do. Credibility. But that is waning. 2 years into the crisis, the authorities have correctly identified 4 crucial problems. Sovereign debt, 1. Bank capital, 2. 2 that go together. The risk of a Greek default, which is sovereign debt, and deficient growth. Excellent that that's put in. That's such a huge fact that hopefully I've been pushing quite strongly. But they have yet to agree on cause and effect. Understanding the obsolescence of most European banks' business models is absolutely crucial to sorting that out, and they're not going to understand that. In general, the Eurozone has outsized banks. Assets equivalent to 325% of GDP that are highly leveraged. The 15 largest banks' leverage is 28.9 times their equity capital. They are also dependent on large quantities of wholesale debt. Here's a number coming up, totaling €4.9 trillion, 27% of total Eurozone loans, with 660 billion maturing in the next 2 years. And I think it's a bit more actually than 660 billion, but such a good article, I've got to think that he's right. To fund the lower yielding assets, in other words, this is the short-term funding. According to Barclays Capital, the 15 largest banks increased their returns on equity by 58% between 1998 and 2007, with 90% of the gain coming from higher leverage. What they've done is leveraged up safe bets. They're making small amounts because they're making safe bets. but leveraging it up so they make lots and lots and lots of little amounts. That's the idea. But as noted here, the European bank's business model is absolutely crucial to sorting that out. That's got to stop, because the leverage has got to stop. And also it must be said that they took on quite a lot of the non-safe US mortgage-backed securities and other acronym crap that the Americans didn't keep because they realized in time that it was crap and sold it on to the Europeans. But it finishes here with, once a leveraged EFSF fails, this is the end of the article and the EFSF has already failed, it should be clear that Eurozone will not last in its current form. Fair enough. The cause is excessive public and private indebtedness, coupled with the absence of an effective bailout mechanism. The effect is collapsing confidence in banks and sovereign debt. Confidence, credit, credibility, the two of them together, there's just not enough. I mean, they're selling their last thing for the trying to sell EFSF to China. China will take up some, but who else is going to buy all this stuff? It's coming to the end of the game. Unless, of course, the solution is either broad and deep restructuring that imposes losses on the private sector, what can't be paid won't be paid, or an ever more expensive bailout by taxpayers. They can't afford it anymore. The latter would be credible only if carried out by the ECB. In other words, the people really can't afford it. The ECB prints the money and spends it on their behalf, knowing it'll never be paid back, at the expense of its mandate. In other words, it's not allowed to do so, but what the hell if it saves the world? Until this choice is made, no amount of additional capital will assuage the private sector's fears, and nor should it. Right, this is Global Banking Glut and its Consequences, a lecture, fantastic lecture. I'll try and link to it here at John Hopkins by Hyun Song Shin, Princeton. Very nicely put across. But from his lecture, the PDF, which I had up so I could see the charts better, all I'm trying to show here is banking and the model in yellow here. Don't get too carried away with the green and the red, but the green and the red aren't yellow. They're not customer deposits, and this is funding the banks. MMF is money market funds. So much of the European banks are funded short term on American boomer retirement funds, money market funds. So that's how much they are funded by customer deposits. That's Barclays, going from 1992, where it was well over half, to now where it's what, not even a third. And this is the same for BNP Paribas in France. There's customer deposits in yellow. And that's Commerzbank. There are more in the PDF, but those are the ones I've dragged out. And I've gone longer than I wanted, so I'll leave this one and do it separately. I'll leave it up for you to read. And the question I leave with you at the end of this is, on the writing there, the reason it works this way is that at some point this sort of condition gets so big that somebody decides to do something about it. And I'm looking for that person to do something about it. And if you spot them, tell me, because if I spot them, I'll tell you. Have a good week. Bye.